The Black Death, the death that redrew Europe. Europe, 14th century. A continent divided by kingdoms, crusades, and wars, but united unknowingly by an invisible catastrophe. A shadow from the heart of Asia swept away borders, beliefs, and systems. Where it was, the silence of death became absolute. It was the plague, the Black Death, and it didn't just decimate Europe. It redrew the world. Between the years 1347 and 1353, the European continent was shaken by one of the deadliest pandemics in history, the Black Death. This health crisis not only led to the deaths of tens of millions of people, but radically transformed the social, political, economic, and cultural structure of Eurasia. Today it is estimated that between 75 and 200 million people died as a direct result of this epidemic. However, its true impact can only be understood by considering the confluence of factors that made it possible: the expansion of trade, the mobility of people, the lack of medical knowledge, and the very structure of medieval society. During the 13th and 14th centuries, the Eurasian world was more connected than ever. The Mongol Empire, at its height, offered relative political and military stability that favored trade along the Silk Road. Cities such as Samarkand, Baghdad, Cairo, and Constantinople were commercial centers of great dynamism. At the same time, Europe was beginning to emerge from feudal isolation, increasing its trade with Asia and North Africa. However, growing population density, urban overcrowding, poor sanitary conditions, and poor medical knowledge made cities vulnerable to any epidemic outbreak. The plague would find in these conditions a fertile ground for its expansion. New research, the discovery in Kyrgyzstan. For centuries, scholars debated the true geographical origin of the plague. The theories pointed to East Asia, but without conclusive evidence. This changed recently thanks to research published in 2022 in the journal Nature. An interdisciplinary team of geneticists and historians analyzed human remains in 2 cemeteries in Kyrgyzstan's Issyk-Kul region. There, on tombstones dated 1338 and 1339, explicit references to a pestilence were identified. Analysis of ancient DNA confirmed that the remains contained the oldest known strain of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the Black Death. This finding positions Central Asia as the epicenter of the outbreak that would soon cross Eurasia. It was a key mutation that gave rise to the variants that would ravage Europe years later. Analyses of the genome of Yersinia pestis also revealed that it was an ancestral strain, the basis of the plague's gene tree. Scientists associate the appearance of the Black Death in Europe with a genetic Big Bang. The original bacteria, carried by rodent fleas, diversified massively in the first half of the 14th century. The strains discovered in Kyrgyzstan are at the heart of this massive diversification, indicating that the Caucasus region was a starting point. They lived in the heart of the Silk Roads. They probably traveled extensively, which contributed to the spread of the epidemic across the Black Sea, added historian Phil Slavin. Today, that finding not only allows us to trace the origin of a past catastrophe, it also reminds us that, even in the 21st century, new pandemics can sprout from the same corridors of global contact. The invisible still has the power to alter the course of history. The arrival in Europe and the fulminant expansion. Yersinia pestis is mainly transmitted through the bite of infected fleas that parasitize black rats. When fleas die, fleas seek out new hosts, including humans. There are 3 clinical forms of the disease: bubonic, the most common, septicemic and pneumonic. The latter could be transmitted by air, making it even more difficult to control. Maritime trade was the main vector of entry. In 1347, Genoese ships from Kaffa, Crimea, arrived at the port of Messina in Sicily. The crew had visible symptoms, and soon after, the disease spread like fire in a dry forest. From Sicily, the plague spread to Genoa, Pisa, Marseilles, and then to Barcelona, Paris, London, Florence, and Vienna. The land and sea trade routes acted as channels of transmission. In less than 4 years, almost all of Europe was affected. Mortality rates ranged from 30 to 60% of the population, depending on the region. Never before had commerce connected the world so deeply. And never before had that same trade become the vehicle for such a global tragedy. In cities like Venice, an innovative measure was taken. All ships were to remain isolated for 40 days before disembarking, hence the term quarantine. A desperate act, but rational, an attempt to stop the unstoppable. Social chaos, and the breakdown of the established order. Parish records and tax documents show that entire villages disappeared. In cities such as Florence and Paris, the population was reduced by half. The cemeteries could not cope, and mass graves were dug. The chronicles of the time, such as those of Giovanni Boccaccio in the Decameron, reflect chaos, fear, and the breakdown of the social order. The plague not only caused death, but also the breakdown of the social fabric. Many abandoned the sick out of fear. Doctors, unable to understand the disease, offered useless remedies. The Church, unable to offer cure or consolation, saw its authority questioned. Movements such as the Flagellants emerged, who toured Europe self-flagellating in public penance. The persecution of minorities, especially Jewish communities, accused of poisoning wells, intensified. Pogroms and massacres occurred in multiple regions. Fear fueled bigotry and violence. In a few years, certainties that had been intact for centuries crumbled. Faith, nobility, medicine, order. They all showed their limits. Medieval society was confronted with its own impotence. A lesson that remains valid every time a new crisis hits us off guard. Economic and cultural transformation. The sharp reduction in the population had profound consequences. With less labor available, wages rose and peasants gained bargaining power against feudal lords. Many lands were abandoned. The feudal system entered into crisis, and the transition to a more urban and mercantile economy accelerated. In addition, technological and agricultural innovations emerged that were not necessary before. With fewer people, better tools were needed. In the long run, These transformations laid the foundation for the Renaissance and the decline of the medieval order. And so, out of the rubble of death, new forms of life emerged. What was ruin was also the seed of renewal. Medicine, symbols, and collective memory. Medicine based on the theory of humors proved to be ineffective. Although there were no immediate scientific advances, skepticism was sown towards traditional explanations. This would drive, centuries later, the emergence of empirical thought and the scientific method. The plague doctors were born, hired by towns and cities to treat the infected, register deaths, perform autopsies, and dispose of corpses. The role of plague doctors was to treat plague victims who resided within the town or city that hired them to provide them with medical help. Although most of the treatments performed by plague doctors were designed to ward off the disease, they were usually ineffective in treating the disease and preventing its spread. The treatments also varied and coincided with the medical knowledge of the time. Most treatments involved religious atonement, consumption of exotic tonics, or the balancing of the humors found within the human body. It was believed that bodily humors were fluids within the human body that, if balanced, allowed the person to remain healthy. Common treatments included bleeding to drain the patient's bad blood, animal cures that involved rubbing naked parts of live chickens or parts of snakes on the skin of the infected victim, drinking potions composed of crushed emeralds, arsenic, or mercury. Another popular potion, known as Four Thieves vinegar, was made with cider, vinegar, or wine mixed with certain spices. Fumigation of homes with incense or smoke to combat the spread of bad air. The only effective measures to avoid infection involved quarantine. Most other measures were not only ineffective, but worsened the symptoms of the plague. After treating the patient, plague doctors had to quarantine for a certain number of days. A definite feature of plague doctors was the unique attire, and specifically the mask that doctors wore while administering treatments. The typical costume of a plague doctor consisted of a coat and accessories such as gloves, boots, and a wide-brimmed hat. The most unique feature of the outfit was the mask that looked like a bird's beak. It contained aromatic elements such as dried herbs and flowers, which were used to block the bad air that caused the imbalance of body humors and possible diseases. While the logic behind wearing the mask was proven false, it is believed that it itself could have prevented plague doctors from becoming infected, as it provided some protection against body fluids and respiratory droplets. Plague doctors had a common accessory, a wooden cane that they used to examine patients without having to touch them. Some infected people thought that the Black Death was a punishment from God, and asked the doctors to beat them with the cane to make amends for their sins. The most famous was Nostradamus, who advised avoiding bloodletting, drinking clean air, fresh water, and using rose hips as an infusion. His voice was a rare exception to sanity in the midst of chaos. The danse macabre wasn't just a terrifying sight. It was a brutal pedagogy. They all danced with death, kings, beggars, clerics, and soldiers. And art became a mirror of collective anguish, but also a form of emotional resistance. The legacy of a catastrophe. Although the most devastating outbreak occurred in the 14th century, the plague continued to appear for centuries. The last major outbreak was in Marseilles in 1720. Only with the bacteriological advances of the 19th century and the control of vectors in the 20th century was it possible to stop its spread. Today, there are still cases in regions such as Madagascar or the southwestern United States. It is treated with antibiotics, but it has not completely disappeared. The Black Death was a tragedy of colossal proportions, but also a turning point. Arising in Central Asia, spread along trade routes and amplified by ignorance, it laid bare the weaknesses of the structures of the 14th century. Today, when the world is facing new health, ecological, or technological threats, the story of the Black Death speaks to us with an ancient voice, but urgent. Not all rebirth comes from planned progress. Sometimes we are reborn because there is nothing left but to do it. Because sometimes true change is not born of progress, but of collapse. Death did not equal everyone, but it forced the world to be reborn. A wound that changed the social order, that paved the way for modern thought, that shattered long-held certainties and sowed new ones.